What's up, guys? Welcome to my channel. Today, we will be reading some true stories from the darker side of Reddit. But I mean, is there even a lighter side? In all seriousness, this video is perfect to put on during a road trip, while sleeping, studying, getting some chores done, or just chilling out. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more spooky content. When I was 22, I spent a lot of time at my uncle's cabin, a small place in the remote part of rural Pennsylvania. It was nestled in a valley, just a few miles from the nearest town, but it felt like it was in the middle of nowhere. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, with a narrow creek running along the back. You could barely see the neighbor's house from the porch, just a flicker of lights through the trees at night. I'd go there to get away from everything: college, work, people. It was peaceful, isolated. Most nights, I loved the quiet, but every now and then, the silence got a little too thick. This was one of those nights. It was late summer, and I was sitting in a small sunroom that overlooked the woods. It had huge windows, and on a clear night, you could see the moonlight flickering through the leaves. I had the windows open to let the cool air in, and I was watching a movie on my laptop. The forest outside was full of the usual sounds: crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. But then I heard something that didn't fit: a splash. I paused the movie, thinking maybe it was just a deer crossing the creek. But it wasn't a single splash. It was rhythmic, steady, like someone was walking through the water. The creek wasn't deep enough to swim in, and it was way too far from any trails for someone to be hiking through at this hour. I muted my laptop, straining to listen. The splashing continued, deliberate, like footsteps moving through the creek bed. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something. But then, faintly, I heard something else. A voice. Someone humming. My skin prickled. No one should be out here this late, and certainly not walking through the creek in the dark. I stood up slowly and moved closer to the window, trying to see through the trees. But the moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, and the creek was just out of view. I listened again. The humming stopped, but the splashing didn't. My first thought was to ignore it, maybe even call my uncle to tell him about it later. But something in the back of my mind was gnawing at me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to step outside and check it out. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and quickly opened the back door, stepping out onto the porch. The night was still, except for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. The sound of splashing was gone now, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I flicked on the flashlight and scanned the yard, the beam cutting through the darkness. Everything seemed normal. No movement, no sounds, just the usual rustle of the forest. But then, just as I was about to turn back inside, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. In the beam of the flashlight, on the edge of the creek, there was a shape. It was a person, standing ankle deep in the water, their back turned to me. I froze, my stomach dropping. I couldn't make out any details, but they were just standing there, completely still. The beam of light danced across their silhouette, and my breath caught in my throat. Who the hell would be out here at this time of night? I cleared my throat, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Hey," I called out. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, half submerged in the creek, facing away from me. The air felt suddenly colder, and I had this overwhelming urge to get back inside. I stepped backward, keeping the flashlight on the figure, waiting for them to react. Then, slowly, they turned their head, just enough so I could barely see their face. In the faint light, I could make out the curve of their jawline, but nothing more. I took another step back, my heart pounding now. I called out again, "Do you need help?" No response. The figure just stood there, motionless. That was enough for me. I turned and rushed back inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a lost hiker, someone who wandered too far off the trail. But who walks through a creek at midnight? I texted my cousin Matt, who lived a few miles away, telling him what had happened. No reply. I tried to focus on my movie, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every noise made me jump. Every creak of the cabin sounded like footsteps approaching. Then, 15 minutes later, I heard it. A soft knock on the window. Just 3 taps, slow and deliberate. I froze, my blood running cold. The knock came again, louder this time. Someone was definitely outside. I grabbed the fireplace poker and crept around the window. My heart was racing, but I had to know if it was a person from the creek. I flicked off the light and peeked through the curtain. At first, I saw nothing, just the darkness of the yard, but then, just beyond the edge of the light, I saw movement. A figure, standing just out of sight. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew they were there, watching. I backed away, my mind racing. In a panic, I texted my dad, telling him what had happened. He called back immediately and told me to stay put, not to go outside. He said he'd drive over, but it would take at least half an hour. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. The knocking stopped, but the air felt thick with tension. I sat there in the dark, gripping the poker, until finally, I heard the familiar rumble of my dad's truck coming up the driveway. He burst through the door, asking if I was okay. But by then, it was over. We searched the yard with flashlights, but whoever had been there was gone. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone. But the next morning, when the sun was up and I felt a little braver, I went down to the creek, and there, in the mud near the water's edge, there were 2 things I'll never forget. A set of muddy footprints leading into the woods, and a single muddy handprint on the porch railing, just outside the sunroom. I never found out who it was, but I haven't been back to that cabin since. I have a dog named Rocky. Every day, without fail, we go on 3 walks. Once in the morning, again in the afternoon, and then at night. We've been doing this for years, always sticking to the same route around my neighborhood. I live in a small, quiet area at the edge of town, where the houses thin out and the streetlights get fewer and dimmer. The route takes us to an old, abandoned factory just a couple of blocks from my house. The factory has been closed down for as long as I can remember, and it's become one of those places people avoid. It's not the kind of rundown building that feels haunted, it's just empty, forgotten. There's a road that leads past it, and that stretch is always eerily quiet at night. Only a few streetlights work, so I usually bring a flashlight just to be safe. It's part of our routine, and for the longest time, it never seemed strange. Until one night. It was just like any other late evening. It was around 11:30 p.m., and Rocky and I were out for our final walk. The air was cool, and the neighborhood was still, with most people already inside for the night. I had one earbud in, listening to some music, but I kept the other ear open in case I needed to hear something. An old habit of mine when walking at night. We were walking along our usual path, passing the factory like we always do, when I thought I heard something strange. It was faint, and at first I didn't pay much attention. I assumed it was a distant noise, maybe the wind or some animal rustling around in the brush. But then I heard it again. This time I stopped, pulled out my earbud and stood still, listening. For a moment there was just silence. Then, faintly, I heard it. Someone calling out, a voice coming from up ahead, near the old factory. "Help," it said. It was a soft, distant, barely audible. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, so I strained to listen, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. Rocky didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He was just sniffing around a nearby tree, completely oblivious. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The voice, it sounded flat, almost robotic, like it was coming through a speaker. I couldn't see anyone, and there were no movement up by the factory. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and kept walking. A few steps later, I heard it again. Help. This time, the voice sounded closer, but still muffled, like it was being projected from behind something. My stomach twisted. It didn't sound like a person calling for help. It sounded wrong. Mechanized, emotionless. And it wasn't coming from in front of me anymore. It was off to the left, where a few old, rusted cars were parked near the factory's lot. I stopped dead in my tracks, scanning the area with my flashlight. Rocky had stopped too. His ears were perked up, and he was staring in the same direction. The beam of my flashlight swept across the cars, but there was nothing. No movement, just the cold, empty shells of those abandoned vehicles. But then I heard it again. Help, the voice repeated. This time, it sounded even more distorted, like a recording being played on a loop. My skin crawled. It was coming from right behind one of the cars. My heart was racing, and my instincts were screaming at me to leave. Everything about the situation felt wrong. There were no real desperation in the voice, no urgency. It was flat, emotionless, almost like bait. My pace quickened until I was practically jogging, and by the time we reached the house, I was out of breath, my hands shaking. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, feeling a rush of relief to be inside. I tried to explain what had happened to my dad, but he brushed it off. Probably just some kids messing around, he said, not really listening. Or maybe you heard some stray noise from the factory. That place still has equipment inside, right? I wasn't convinced. The voice had sounded too strange, too unnatural. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? I had no proof, and I wasn't even sure what I'd heard. A few days later, the curiosity got the better of me, and I walked past the factory again, this time in broad daylight. The area looked as normal as ever, rusting cars, cracked pavement, the same old boarded-up building. But when I got to the spot where I heard the voice, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Behind one of the cars, there was a small speaker, barely visible beneath a pile of debris. It was old, cracked, and half buried, but it looked like it had been placed there deliberately. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to know what it had been connected to. I don't walk past the factory at night anymore. I don't care if it was some prank or something. Whatever it was, that voice was not calling for help. It was calling for me. My name is Ethan, and I'll be honest, I feel lost. My family life is a wreck, and I've spent years trying to escape it. High school friends have drifted away, leaving me feeling more isolated than ever in my small, suffocating hometown. I'm nearing graduation from college, but the future feels bleak and uncertain. Last summer, I ended up in Porto, Portugal, mostly as a way to distance myself from the chaos back home. One humid night, I found myself at a small bar called A Larera, tucked away in a dimly lit alley. I was alone, nursing a drink and contemplating my next steps when I realized my apartment keys were missing. Just my luck. I rustled through my pockets, but they were nowhere to be found. Knowing I was locked out, I left the bar and started walking aimlessly toward my apartment, fully aware that I had no way of getting in. The streets were quiet at that hour, and I didn't want to disturb my landlord for a spare set. Instead, I figured I'd find a place to wait out the night. As I wandered through the narrow, cobblestone streets, the sky opened up and it began to rain heavily. I ducked under an overpass by the Douro River, grateful for the shelter. As I tried to make myself comfortable on the damp ground, I began to hear voices drifting across the water. I sat up, squinting through the darkness, and that's when I saw them. There were 4 men gathered near a small, weathered boat tied to the riverbank. They seemed unaware of my presence, so I held my breath and stayed hidden. It didn't take long for me to realize I was witnessing something illicit, drugs, money, or some other shady deal. Though my Portuguese was shaky, the tension was clear, punctuated by the way they exchanged duffel bags and whispered urgently. Just when I thought it might be safe to slip away unnoticed, One of the men erupted into a furious tirade, his voice booming in the still night air. He pulled out a gun and aimed it at another man, and my heart dropped. I was frozen, horrified at what I was witnessing, an armed robbery in real time. The man with the gun barked orders, and they stripped the victim of his belongings, throwing his possessions into the river like trash. My instincts kicked in. I couldn't stay there any longer. I slowly rose to my feet, hoping to retreat silently. But just as I turned to leave, one of the men replied, "There's someone over there." Panic surged through me. I didn't look back. I took off down the alley, sprinting with every ounce of strength I had left. My lungs burned with each breath, and my heart raced as I ran blindly through the rain-soaked streets. The shouts of the men faded behind me, but the adrenaline drove me forward. After what felt like an eternity, I found myself near the entrance of my apartment building. Heart pounding, I realized quickly that I left a window slightly ajar before I had gone out earlier. It was a gamble, but it was my only option. I hurried around to the back, where the ground floor units were. With my heart in my throat, I climbed up to the first floor, trying to stay quiet. I spotted my window and breathed a sigh of relief. It was still open, just enough for me to squeeze through. I climbed inside, landing softly on the floor of my dark apartment. The stillness greeted me like a ghost. I locked the window behind me, my hands trembling as I tried to shake off the fear that still clung to me. I sat on the couch, my heart racing as I replayed the night in my mind, wondering what could have happened if I hadn't escaped. The encounter by the river haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows still lingered outside, waiting for the next unwitting soul to wander too close. It was an ordinary Friday afternoon at my high school in Bristol. I was walking down the corridor with my friend Mia, half listening to her vent about her latest crush. My mind, however, was elsewhere. I was grappling with the chaos of my foster home, and school felt like just another burden. As we passed the library, a sudden urge to use the bathroom hit me. I asked Mia if she wanted to join me, but she shook her head, preferring to stay outside and check her phone. I headed into the restroom, surprised to find it eerily empty. This bathroom was usually bustling with students, but today it felt more like a tomb. I shrugged it off and entered the stall. Moments after settling in, I heard the heavy bathroom door creak open and shut. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone was trying to sneak in without being seen by the hall monitors. After finishing up, I stood to button my jeans, idly examining the grimy graffiti on the walls. Then I heard the door open again, but this time there was nothing. No footsteps, no chatter, just an unsettling silence. I figured whoever had come in was probably just leaving. As I stepped outside of the stall, I was startled to find Mia standing by the door, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. "What's wrong?" I asked, a knot tightening in my stomach. She leaned in closer, her voice trembling. "Who was that standing right behind you in the stall?" A cold shiver ran down my spine. "What do you mean? No one was in there with me." Mia's expression hardened, her fear palpable. "I came in because I needed to go, and when I looked over, I saw someone standing right behind you. So close their shoes were nearly touching yours. I freaked out and bolted." My heart raced. I hadn't heard anyone enter the stall with me, but I distinctly remembered the door opening and closing. Mia wasn't the type to joke around like this, especially not with that look on her face. We decided to find a teacher to report it, but when we did, they brushed us off. "It's probably just a trick of the light," the admin said, barely looking up from her desk. "You girls should stop playing pranks." But the vividness of Mia's fear and the unsettling certainty that I wasn't alone in that stall gnawed at me. I left the office feeling a sense of dread I couldn't shake. Over the years, I've tried to forget that day, but I could still hear the echo of the bathroom door swinging shut and the feeling of someone watching me. I never set foot in that restroom again, and I still avoid that part of the school, haunted by the unknown presence that lurked there. while back, I moved into a small, nondescript bungalow in a quiet neighborhood in Portland. It was a cozy, single-story home with 2 bedrooms, a tiny bathroom, and just enough space for me to feel comfortable alone. After weeks of searching for the right place, I was relieved to finally have found somewhere I could call my own. My landlord, Miss Thompson, was warm and welcoming, probably choosing me as a tenant because I was a woman living alone. At first, everything seemed normal. I settled into my new routine and quickly made the place my own. But then, after a few weeks, strange things began happening. One night, as I was unwinding after work, I heard a soft knock on the front door. It was late, too late for a casual visitor. I called out hesitantly, "Who is it?" but received no answer. An uneasy feeling crept over me. Who would be knocking at this hour? The next morning, I opened the door to leave for work and noticed a note taped to the door. In neat, bold handwriting, it read, "Good morning, beautiful." My stomach twisted. There was no doubt that this was connected to the knock from the night before. Who had left it? I ripped the note off and tossed it in the trash, hoping it was a one-time occurrence. But it wasn't. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard another knock, this time a little earlier. My heart raced. I approached the door and stood still, listening intently. There was no peephole, and the flimsy door didn't have a proper lock, leaving me feeling exposed and vulnerable. A creeping suspicion began to set in. I might have a stalker. In a panic, I called my sister for advice. She tried to be supportive, but I could hear the worry in her voice. She insisted I stay cautious, and I remembered my father's advice from long ago. Always trust your instincts. But I didn't want to overreact. I figured it might just be an odd coincidence. The next morning, I steeled myself for the worst. As I opened the door, I found another note, which read, "I love watching you cook." My heart sank as I took a picture and sent it to my sister, asking if she thought I should involve the police. She responded quickly, urging me to call them immediately. Feeling unnerved, I decided to confront this person. I left a note of my own on the door. "If you're looking for someone else, you've got the wrong house. Stop leaving notes or I'll call the police." Writing the note felt like a small victory, a way to reclaim some sort of control over the situation. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every little creak of the house set my heart racing. The wind howled outside, and I imagined dark shapes lurking in the shadows. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, but as the hours passed, I was left on edge. The next morning, I discovered another note waiting for me. "I'm not looking for anyone else. I'm watching you, Claire." My name. Panic surged through me. I texted my sister immediately, and she told me she was on her way over. When she arrived, we both decided to call the police together. We hoped that if the stalker saw the police car, they would be scared off. An officer came, and after my sister explained everything, he took our statements, but there was little he could do without seeing anything suspicious himself. That night, my sister stayed over, and we set up a makeshift barricade in front of the door, just in case. We stayed up late, watching the shadows dance under the streetlights, straining to hear any unusual sounds. The hours dragged on, but thankfully, the night passed without incident. I was no longer comfortable living in that house. The next day, I packed my things and moved out. Miss Thompson was sympathetic to my situation, and when I asked her if she had any idea who it might be, she shook her head in confusion. After I relocated to a new place, I thought I could finally breathe easy. I hoped that whoever had been watching me wouldn't follow me, that I had escaped their grasp. But even now, sometimes, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance to watch me. When I was 16, I decided to take salsa dance classes at a local community center in the small town of Brookfield. It was a common pastime for teenagers, and I thought it would be a fun way to meet new people. During each class, we had to switch partners for every song. which meant I ended up dancing with every guy in the group. Most of the dancers were between 15 and 18, but there was one man who stood out, Gabriel. At 22, he towered over the rest of us, almost 2 meters tall, and he carried an unsettling energy that made him feel older than he actually was. We had a few friendly chats during the dances, but something about him made me feel uneasy. I was young and naive, so when he asked where I lived, I told him without a second thought. That's when the strange visits began. Gabriel would ride his bike to my house unannounced, asking if I wanted to go for a walk or hang out. At first, I thought he might just be overly friendly, but deep down, I felt something was off. I didn't even know what stalking was back then. This happened several times before I finally asked my parents to tell him I wasn't home when he showed up. Initially, we were all oblivious to how creepy the situation was. Then, one day, he just stopped coming to class, and I thought that was the end of it. Around this time, I started dating a boy from school named Derek. Everything seemed great, but soon I learned that Gabriel was friends with Derek's best friend. That made things uncomfortable. I also discovered that Gabriel had been in and out of a mental health facility. Each time he disappeared, I felt a sense of relief, as those were the only moments I could truly relax. When I turned 17, my family had to move. Our landlord decided to sell the house, and we found a place just a few streets away from Gabriel's old home. It didn't take long for him to start showing up again, riding his bike to our new house. It wasn't as frequent as before, but it was still unsettling. Then came my dad's birthday. My parents were hosting a party when Gabriel rang the doorbell. I was asked to answer it, and when I opened the door, I was met by him looming over me like a dark cloud. Panic set in as I tried to close the door, but he blocked it with his body, as if he had the right to be there. I begged him to leave, but he wouldn't budge. I ran to get my dad, but he dismissed my concerns, telling me it was my problem to handle. After nearly 2 hours of pleading with Gabriel to go, he finally left. It was then that I realized this was more than just strange behavior. It was stalking. The next day, I confronted my parents about everything, expressing how scared I was of Gabriel. My dad apologized for not taking my fears seriously, and when Gabriel showed up again, he finally told him to stay away. For a while, I thought we were free of him, but every few months, a letter, an email, or small gift would arrive, reminding me that he wasn't gone. At 20, I worked at an after-school program at a nearby elementary school. One morning, my mom woke me up, telling me she had called the police. Gabriel had been coming to our house every morning, asking for me. My parents hadn't told me because they didn't want to scare me. The police came and told him to leave, but he ignored them, resulting in his arrest. As he was taken away, he screamed my name, claiming he was burning for me and that the officers were hurting him. My parents and I stood frozen in the kitchen, listening to his frantic screams. The whole ordeal felt so surreal that I started to laugh, caught between shock and fear. We filed a police report for stalking and trespassing, but the officers informed us there wasn't much they could do since Gabriel hasn't physically assaulted me. We attempted to secure a restraining order, but it was denied. Just a week later, Gabriel snuck into our backyard, throwing small stones at my window as if it were some twisted romantic gesture. I made the mistake of opening the window, but when I didn't see anyone, I ran downstairs to alert my dad. By the time he got outside, Gabriel had vanished. A few more days passed, and Gabriel showed up again. This time, I opened the door without thinking. There he was, telling me how much he missed me and that he had been peeking through our living room blinds every night for the past week. My parents weren't home, and I felt completely trapped. Just then, my new boyfriend, Ethan, arrived. I had texted him an SOS, and he rushed over. Ethan firmly told Gabriel to leave, and reluctantly he did, but not before casually mentioning that he had a girlfriend now. That was the last I saw of Gabriel for a while. Later, I learned he had been committed to a psychiatric hospital after claiming his mother was possessed by a demon. 2 years later, I received a letter from the court. Gabriel had been arrested for assaulting his girlfriend. During a violent altercation, he had hit her, and she pretended to be unconscious until the police arrived. He was sent back to the psychiatric hospital, and finally, I managed to get a restraining order. He was ordered to stay at least 30 meters away from me and my family. After 8 long years of living in fear, it felt like it was finally over. Now, 2 years later, I've moved out of my parents' house and started a new life. Recently, I began to notice someone who looks just like Gabriel lingering near my apartment building. I can't be sure if it's truly him or just my mind playing tricks on me. But the familiar fear is creeping back in, and I can't shake the feeling. Am I really safe? Or is this nightmare about to start all over again? Back in my college days, I spent more time pursuing women than I'd like to admit. After an unsettling experience a few years ago, I've learned to take things much slower. I attended a university in a small town in Missouri. By my sophomore year, I had pledged to a fraternity called Delta Sigma. After months of the same faces at parties and gatherings, I was eager for something different. It was then that I created a profile on a dating app. That's where I met Sarah. She was intriguing and charming, and our online conversations flowed easily. We quickly decided to meet up at a bar called the Rusty Nail on a Friday night. I arrived early to claim a table, thinking of all the games of pool I'd play while I waited. An hour passed, and I began to worry that I'd been stood up. Just as I was about to leave, my phone chimed. Sarah had just arrived. She apologized for being late and ordered a drink, instantly putting me at ease. We hit it off over cocktails, her laughter infectious. As the night went on, I found myself matching her shot for shot. Eventually, she asked for my Snapchat. I handed it over without hesitation, and within moments, my screen was flooded with explicit photos. Shocked but too intoxicated to care, I laughed it off and reciprocated, sending a few of my own back, thinking it was all in good fun. After a few more drinks, when I was on the verge of inviting her to my place, Sarah surprised me by suggesting we go to hers instead. I agreed, and we hopped into a rideshare that took us to her apartment on the outskirts of town. As we arrived, a sense of dread settled in. The neighborhood felt run down, the streetlights flickered ominously, but I shrugged it off. However, as she opened up the door to her apartment, my gut twisted. When I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The lights flickered on, and I froze in shock. 3 men, muscular and bald, stood in the room, their expressions cold and predatory. One of them stepped forward, eyes narrowed, and recited my name, age, even my birthday. "Sarah is just 16, he said, a sinister smile creeping across his face. My heart raced as the realization sank in. I was standing in a room with men who knew too much about me and were armed with the knowledge that I had sent explicit photos to a minor. Fear gripped me, and I felt my stomach churn. The 2 men behind me seized my phone, wallet, and keys before I could even think to resist. They demanded I write down my home address and the names of my friends, threatening to expose my secret if I didn't comply. One of them allowed me to scroll through all my contacts to get numbers, but their eyes were always on me, watching, waiting. In a moment of desperation, I spotted a window and bolted toward it. I pushed it open and tumbled outside, sprinting through the dark street without looking back. I didn't know where I was going, but kept running until I found a well-lit house. I pounded on the door until the startled couple let me inside and allowed me to call 911. When the police arrived, I relayed my terrifying story, but I couldn't recall the exact address of Sarah's apartment. After a frantic search through the area, I was finally able to guide them to the building. However, when they entered, they returned empty-handed. The place was deserted, no signs of life, no trace of the men who had threatened me. The following weeks dragged on as the police launched an investigation, but it led nowhere. They suspected it might be gang-related, but no arrests were ever made. I never discovered who those men were or what their intentions were, but the entire experience left me shaken. I deleted my dating profile that night and swore off online dating for good. I've been a chronic smoker for years, so spare me the judgment, especially since I've recently started seeing a therapist to help me tackle my nicotine addiction. Unfortunately, progress has been slow. On top of that, my sleep schedule is a disaster. I routinely stay up past midnight and rarely drag myself out of bed before noon. As I work on these habits, they're crucial to the unsettling tale I'm about to share. A few months back, I was on my balcony, a nightly ritual, smoking my cigarette. I live in a quiet neighborhood in rural Vermont, where the houses are spaced generously apart. There's a neighbor whose yard I could see over. I didn't know him well, but I figured he lived alone since the only car I'd ever noticed was a dusty green Jeep. One night, however, I spotted a black pickup truck parked in his driveway, one I'd never seen before. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a coincidence. The next night, I kept a closer eye on his yard, and sure enough, the black truck was still there. I didn't think anything sinister was at play. My curiosity simply piqued. The next morning, I peeked outside to find the truck gone. For the rest of the week, I made a little game out of watching the truck, speculating about its purpose. I wasn't being nosy, I was just overly inquisitive. My obsession with the oddities around me is probably why most of my friends have faded away. But I told myself I wouldn't dig deeper until one night changed everything. Around 4 a.m., while smoking my last cigarette, I spotted my neighbor for the first time. He stepped outside, holding a long black bag that looked unusually heavy. He approached the pickup, tossed the bag into the bed, then hopped into the driver's seat and sped off. My heart raced. What could he have been carrying? Fatigued from the night's events, I decided to put it out of my mind until morning. But the next day, curiosity gnawed at me, and I set up on my balcony early, laptop in tow, waiting for the truck to return. Around 11 p.m., the truck pulled into the driveway. I quickly shut my laptop and watched intently. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. The truck just idled there, engine rumbling. Then, the driver's door swung open, and my neighbor emerged. He walked to the back of the truck, pulled out the same black bag, and struggled with its weight before disappearing into his house. That was it. I had to know what was going on. The following morning, I made a snap decision to follow the truck when it left. After a long day of waiting, I finally saw movement in the driveway around 4 a.m. I hurried downstairs, grabbed my keys, and climbed into my car. I turned off my headlights and tailed the truck as it veered onto a secluded dirt path leading into the woods. After several minutes, I realized where they were heading, an abandoned gas station nestled in the clearing. Right in front was the dusty green Jeep, parked like it was waiting for something, or someone. My anxiety peaked, and I quickly turned my car around, parking on the side of the road. I waited for about an hour, fidgeting in my seat until the Jeep finally left. My heart raced as I drove back up the dirt path, parking across from the gas station. The atmosphere felt changed, almost alive. The front door was locked, and so were the side and back entrances. I needed to see what was inside, so I picked up a rock and smashed it against one of the windows. It shattered easily, but the loud alarm that blared startled me to my core. I bolted back to my car, breathless, wondering why an abandoned gas station would even have an alarm system. Panicking, I called 911 and provided a vague description of what I'd seen, adrenaline coursing my veins as I returned home. The next morning, I awoke, hoping everything had settled down. To my shock, I saw several police cars parked in my neighbor's driveway, lights flashing as they escorted him out in handcuffs. One by one, the police vehicles drove away, leaving me in a whirlwind of thoughts. I lit a cigarette, the weight of the situation settling heavily on my chest. I've tried to get details from the police multiple times, but they've remained tight-lipped. Even my attempts to revisit the gas station were futile. The road had been blocked off. Maybe one day, I'll find the courage to venture into the woods and seek the answers that haunt me. Never been one to suffer from sleep disorders like sleep paralysis or night terrors. I've always been a deep sleeper. That's why what happened next was such a shock. This all began when I was living in a small apartment with my roommate, Julia. We kept different schedules due to our jobs, so we rarely saw each other except on weekends. It was a late summer in Portland, Oregon, and the humidity had me cranking the window AC unit at night, which provided a comforting white noise. It was the first night of my nightmares, just days after my recent breakup. In my dream, I found myself at a long dinner table filled with friends and family, when a grotesque creature appeared across from me. It looked like a twisted monster from a horror film, with dark, bulging eyes and jagged teeth. Suddenly, it was looming over me. I started to run away in the dream, but somehow ended up back in my room, or at least a distorted version of it. I woke up in the pitch dark, the AC humming loudly. My heart raced as I recalled the unsettling dream. The next night, I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I usually kept it shut unless I had been drinking, so I assumed Julia had come in. I dismissed it and closed the door before drifting back to sleep. The following day, I texted her, asking if she had come into my room. She replied with a firm no. That night, I was pulled into another nightmare. The creature returned, but this time, the dream was much more disturbing. Instead of the comforting atmosphere of my loved ones, I found myself in a dark, claustrophobic room, and the creature kept getting closer. It felt as though it was wrapping its shadowy fingers around my throat, suffocating me. Then it clawed at me. I jolted awake, feeling a sharp, stinging sensation on my thigh. I rushed to the bathroom, gasping when I saw a fresh gash on my skin. Terrified, I ran to Julia's room, flipping on the light. "How did this happen?" I exclaimed. Julia looked at the thigh in shock, and we searched my room for anything sharp that could have caused it. As we were looking, I suddenly froze, her eyes wide. She gestured for silence and turned off the AC. In the newfound quiet, we heard a faint rustling sound from beneath my bed, like someone was hiding there. I can't believe we didn't scream as we exchanged terrified glances. We bolted from the room and pounded on our neighbor's door. An older woman answered, clearly startled. We asked her for help, and she let us use her phone to call 911. While we waited, we heard a loud bang outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of our apartment door slamming shut. When the police arrived, they confirmed the intruder was gone. We had left all the lights on when we fled, making it clear that someone knew we had seen them. As I reflected on my nightmare, it dawned on me that the creature represented the intruder. With my door being open that night, he could have been lurking around our apartment, possibly even stealing our food. The realization that this person had actually scratched me was deeply disturbing. This experience changed my perspective on dreams and nightmares forever, leaving me to wonder if the true horror lay not in my sleep, but in the reality outside my door. This happened when I was a young child living in our old house in Maplewood, Massachusetts. I was around 6 or 7 years old. My older brother, Jake, and I shared a bedroom on the second floor, which had once been a studio rented by a reclusive artist known for his unsettling paintings. After he moved out, the upstairs became primarily ours, but the remnants of his odd energy lingered. Our room was cavernous and filled with toys, countless action figures and board games crammed into 2 battered chests on opposite sides. Among our many toys was a bright red fire truck with colorful buttons. Pressing these buttons would make the truck's lights flash and produce sounds like sirens, honking, and cheerful melodies. It was a cherished gift from Jake to me, but something about it felt wrong, as if it had a life of its own. One random night, Jake and I were both in bed, unable to sleep. The house creaked and groaned in its stillness, each sound echoing through the darkened halls. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the loud siren sound of the fire truck erupted, and its lights flickered on in the middle of the room, bathing everything in an eerie glow. I jumped in fright, my heart racing, immediately accusing Jake of trying to scare me. He laughed nervously, claiming he hadn't touched it. Just then, the truck fell silent, leaving an unsettling chill hanging in the air. Shaken but exhausted, I eventually drifted off to sleep, my dreams plagued by shadows lurking in the corners. A few nights later, we were in bed again when we heard a strange thud reverberate through the room. Jake insisted on teasing me, pretending there was a ghost. I shouted at him to be quiet or I'd tell Mom. Just then, he noticed a faint light glowing in the corner of the room. It was the fire truck again. Panic gripped me, and I bolted down the stairs, yelling for my mom, the darkness feeling like it was closing in on me. I found her in her room and breathlessly explained about the noise in the glowing truck. Jake followed me in, his face pale as he argued that there was no way he could have turned on the light from his bed. That night, trembling, I ended up sleeping in my parents' room. My heart pounded against my ribs as I tried to block out the thoughts of what might be waiting for us upstairs. Weeks passed without nothing unusual happening, until one night when Jake was at a friend's house for a sleepover. I was alone in our vast room, the silence around me oppressive. I had long since tucked the fire truck away in the small living room across the hall, unable to bear the sight of it. After my mom kissed me goodnight, I requested she leave the door open, the dark corridor beyond feeling like a yawning abyss. As I lay in bed, I heard a sound I couldn't explain, a low rumbling emanating from down the hall. My heart raced as I turned to face the door, gasping as the fire truck rolled into our room, its lights flashing violently, illuminating the dark corners with an unnatural glow. I screamed with all my might, my voice echoed against the walls, calling for my mom and pressing myself against the cold, unyielding wall. Moments later, my parents rushed upstairs, panic in their eyes. They found the truck in the middle of the floor, still lit up, the silence wailing like a banshee in the night. My dad checked every room, searching for any sign of a prankster. He looked under the beds and in the closets, but there was no one. I'm not sure what they thought in that moment. Perhaps they believed it was just a malfunction or a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I sensed they were slightly unnerved too. After all, that toy truck had no feature to move on its own. To ease my fear, my dad smashed the toy. The sound of plastic cracking echoed in the stillness. He tossed the pieces into the neighbor's trash, but I felt only a momentary relief, a thin veil over my lingering dread. I continued to sleep in their room for a few nights, but eventually, my dad insisted I returned upstairs. The experience left an indelible mark on me, shaping my beliefs about the paranormal and haunting my thoughts long after. I could never shake the feeling that something had stirred in that house, something that lingered just beyond the edges of my dreams, waiting for a chance to return. What I'm about to share is the eerie reason my family abandoned the ancestral home that had stood for nearly a century. For most of my childhood, I battled feelings of loneliness and worthlessness. Although I've worked through those feelings now, my early years were marked by isolation. Our house was situated on the outskirts of a fog-laden forest in a small town of Hollow Creek, where the trees seemed to whisper secrets and shadows danced under the pale moonlight. My bedroom, a cavernous space located in the corner of the house, was lined with dusty bookshelves filled with forgotten tales. 2 walls of windows faced the looming forest, their gnarled branches scratching against the glass like skeletal fingers. The isolation unnerved me, amplifying my fear of the dark and conjuring nightmares that felt all too real. Things began to shift when I turned 10. In 5th grade, I found myself caught in that awkward phase where seeking comfort from my parents was seen as childish, yet my imagination still ran wild. The first unsettling occurrence revolved around my cherished nightlight, a vintage lamp shaped like a crescent moon. It had a soft lavender glow I relied on to chase away the shadows. One night, I woke suddenly, shrouded in darkness. It was unusual for me to wake like that, and after a moment of confusion, I drifted back into slumber. But when I stirred again, the moonlight lamp was casting an unsettling green hue across the room, a color I had never used. Dismissing it as a simple malfunction, I tried to forget the incident. A week later, I awoke once more to find the lamp radiating a deep crimson light, casting ominous shadows that twisted and curled along the walls. When I asked my parents about it, they exchanged perplexed glances, insisting they hadn't touched it. Their dismissal stung, and they told me I was imagining things. Then came the morning I discovered the lamp unplugged, lying on the floor, as if tossed aside in a fit of rage. My parents, too preoccupied with their own lives, brushed off my fears. "You're getting too old for that thing," my father said, shaking his head. A few days later, I woke up to find the lamp missing entirely. I was convinced my parents had hidden it, believing I had outgrown it. This belief led to an explosive argument, one that echoed through the stillness of the house. For a week after that, the atmosphere shifted as I began experiencing a series of jarring awakenings, as though something was stirring in the corners of my mind. Each night brought a fresh wave of dread, but my parents dismissed my fears, insisting I was merely adjusting to adolescence. Then, on a particularly stifling night, I decided to remain awake instead of succumbing to the encroaching darkness. As the clock ticked ominously, I heard faint rustling emanating from my closet. My heart raced, and I dashed to my parents' room, breathless with fear. But when my father checked, he found nothing but the usual clutter of forgotten toys and dusty clothes. The rustling persisted for the next 4 nights, and with each intrusion, I felt my sanity slipping further away. Desperate, I implored my parents to believe me. Frustrated, my father dragged me to the closet, determined to prove it was empty. He hurled items aside, revealing layers of dust and forgotten memories, until he tore down an old tapestry that had hung over the wall. What lay behind it left us all speechless, a gaping hole that seemed to lead into a dark void. My mother's terrified gasp filled the room as my father grabbed a flashlight, illuminating the abyss beyond. It was too deep to see anything clearly, but dread settled heavily in the air. He hurried outside to investigate, and there, at the base of the house, he uncovered a small indentation in the earth. Digging deeper revealed a hidden passageway that snuck from the depths of the forest directly into my room. That night, my mother and I fled to my aunt's house, seeking refuge from the terror that had taken root in our lives. We moved out soon after, leaving behind the memories of that cursed place. I stayed with my aunt until we found a new home, a brighter, safer space, though the shadows of that experience still loom over me. To this day, I avoid discussing the incident, but I know that one day I will have to confront it. My parents refused to acknowledge what happened, perhaps feeling guilt for dismissing my fears. It's chilling to realize an unknown intruder had free access to my room night after night, their intentions hidden in the darkness. So, if your children approach you with tales that sound strange or frightening, please, take them seriously. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the edge of their fears. In 2005, when I was 16, my parents decided to take a week-long vacation, leaving me to stay with my older sister, Lila, in her cramped Brooklyn apartment. Lila lived with her 8-year-old son, Oliver, and since it was spring break, both Oliver and I were free from school. The cramped quarters made for a cozy environment, but the worn walls and flickering lights added an unsettling edge. One night, after Oliver begged me to stay up late watching cartoons, Lila dozed off on the couch. I finally tucked Oliver into bed and went to sleep myself, trying to push away the eerie feeling that had settled over the apartment. The next morning, I awoke to a deep, graveling voice echoing from the living room. It wasn't Lila's boyfriend, Max, who had a warm, comforting tone. This voice was different, rougher, older, and tinged with anger. Heart racing, I quietly slipped out of bed and made my way into the dim light of the living room. What I saw stopped me cold. A man sat hunched on the couch, his eyes glinting with a disturbing mix of anger and delight. He looked to be in his 60s, with a scruffy beard and clothes stained with dark, ominous marks. Lila sat across from him, visibly shaken, stealing quick glances my way. The moment the man noticed me, he fell silent, flashed a toothy grin that sent a wave of dread crashing over me. My gaze fell to the knife lying carelessly on the coffee table. I felt my instincts kick in, screaming at me to protect Lila and Oliver, but I had to remain calm. Oliver was still asleep in the bedroom, and I didn't want to do anything to escalate the situation. I scanned my mind for any memory of this man, but nothing came to me. "Didn't know anyone else was staying here," he said in a gruff voice. "Name's Gus, Max's stepdad." I forced a nervous smile and waved slightly, fighting to hide my fear. Gus pulled out a crumpled cigarette, his hand shaking as he lit it. Lila, trying to keep her composure, spoke up. "Please, Gus, not in here. Oliver's just down the hall." Gus raised an eyebrow, letting out a cold laugh that sent chills down my spine. What's he gonna do? He's old enough to know better. He took a long drag, the smoke curling around him. Before I could respond, Lila said quickly, "No, he's just a kid. He's only 8. Gus's eyes bored into me, sizing me up. "Kid looks like he can handle himself. What are they feeding you kids these days?" Lila forced a laugh, but it felt hollow. Gus's tone turned darker as he leaned in. "Anyway, last night, I had to deal with a little problem. You know that loser who thought he could steal from me?" My stomach twisted as he continued, a mantic glint in his eyes. "Found out who it was, made them talk. Let's just say, I don't mess around." I tried to keep my expression neutral, but dread filled my gut. Then I heard the soft creak of the bathroom door opening down the hall. I turned to see Oliver, bleary-eyed, stumbling towards us. Gus's expression shifted, a predatory gleam entered his eyes. "Who else is in this place, Lila?" "Just Oliver," she said, her voice shaky. "Can you finish that outside? I don't want him to smell it." Gus's gaze flicked between the hallway and Lila, tension crackling in the air. "What are you so scared of? I'm not gonna hurt you. You're good people." As he stood, tucking the knife into his jacket, I felt my heart pound. The bathroom light flicked on, and I prayed Oliver wouldn't come into the room. Gus must have sensed my fear because he turned to me and said, "Don't worry, kid. I'm out of here before your nephew sees me like this." Lila opened the door for him, and we watched in silence as he stumbled out and drove off in a battered sedan, the engine sputtering as it faded into the distance. As soon as he was gone, Lila grabbed the phone and dialed 911. Oliver, emerging from the bathroom, looked confused. "Mom, is the scary man gone?" Lila hugged him tightly, trying to hold back her own fear. I paced the room, playing every moment in my head. Once she hung up, Lila explained who Gus was, sharing that he had reputation for trouble. Max had warned her about his erratic behavior, but she hadn't realized just how dangerous he could be. The police arrived shortly after, and Gus was arrested within hours. We learned later that he had a long history of violence, including multiple assault charges. He was facing serious time for his actions, but the memory of his twisted smile and menacing words haunted me for years. Even now, years later, I can still hear his graveling voice and see the knife glinting in the dim light of that living room. It serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly a sense of security can shatter, leaving behind shadows that linger long after the danger has passed.